Well, we've reached the next segment of Revelation, starting in chapter 6. The Lion Lamb, King Jesus, has been found worthy to open the seals of the scroll and to therefore unfurl God's purposes and plans for the world. And so we begin at the unfolding of history of the world according to the purposes of God himself and the Lamb who was slain, Jesus Christ the King. So here is the first verse of chapter 6 in Revelation. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. Then I heard one of the four living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." So we start with the Lamb opening the first of the seven seals on the scroll, and here it's a good point to talk a little about the sevens that occur across the next lot of chapters in Revelation. It can be quite confusing to see exactly where we are when we're reading Revelation and how it fits together as a whole, but the series of sevens give us some anchorage points to help us. So here's how the sevens work in the structure of Revelation. There are the seven seals, as is chapter 5 verse 1 to chapter 8 verse 1. There's the seven trumpets, chapter 8 verse 2 to chapter 11 verse 18. Now in the midst of that there are the seven thunders. They're in chapter 10, sort of the second half of verse 3 and verse 4, but they're stopped. And that's significant, and we'll have a look at that when we get there. And then there's the seven bowls in chapter 16, verses 1 to 21. So the series of sevens now that we're in at the moment and started in chapter 5 take us to the end of chapter 16. And it's really important to remembering, of course, that Revelation is a book that uses signs and symbols deliberately and trying to make sure that when we read it, we allow the picture that it's painting to sweep over us and sort of capture our imagination, as opposed to letting us get caught up in the kind of nitty-gritty of the detail and trying to guess the specific meanings of each and every phrase. Now we'll look at some of the meanings, or we'll look at some of the things that they might have meant, but let's make sure we capture that bigger picture. The sevens are trying to help us to do just that, keeping in mind the bigger picture. Now remember that 7 is symbolic in and of itself. This is the number of completeness or wholeness or perfection. So here we have, if you like, the whole of history, the completeness of history, which is now unfolding according to God's purposes and plans, because the Lamb who was slain for the sins of the world is worthy. Jesus is worthy to take God's plans for this world and to work them out across human history. It's vital then that we see that the four lots of sevens, the seals, the trumpets, the thunders which are stopped, and then the bowls, are not following one another in a kind of sequential order or a linear timescale. They are instead different perspectives of the same events. So with the seven seals, we see history working itself out according to the God's purposes. And then with the seven trumpets, we see that very same history working itself out according to God's purposes, presented in a different way from a different angle. And this is history from the perspective of the heavenly throne room. Let's not forget that either. There will be some mystery for us here. We won't understand every jot and tittle, but we're not supposed to. We're meant to allow the grand sweep of the story of God's purposes and plans working out in the world to capture us and to bring us in hope and in worship to the throne room of God himself, just as we saw in chapter 5 with the worship of the one who sits on the throne and the worship of the Lamb, Jesus Christ himself as well. So another thing we need to know about the sevens is that they're talking about different parts of history. So broadly, in each of the sevens, we have numbers 1 to 5 of the seven bowls or the seals or the trumpets, which are telling us about the realities of human history, lived history, history we know, history that would make sense to John's readers in the 1st century, and history as it makes sense to us in the 21st century. Then number 6 of each of the sequences is telling us about what happens at the end of history. A kind of what happens when Jesus Christ is revealed and God closes this epoch of history. And then finally number 7 is telling us about the final judgment and beyond. So we're entering into some of the more complex parts of Revelation, the complexities of its language and its imagery. But the sevens here help us to keep anchored and to allow the weight of God's plans and purposes to pick up our imaginations and lead us to the victory of the Lamb who was slain, the Lion Lamb, Jesus Christ the King. Today, chapter 6, verse 1, one of the four living creatures has just beckoned John to come and to look at what is happening as Jesus the Lamb opens the first seal. And we'll think about this in the next video.